Japan before the samurai was not a story of warriors or empires or written codes of honor. It was a world before definition, a world where silence was louder than authority and nature ruled more completely than any human ever could. Mountains split the land into isolated regions like broken fragments of a forgotten whole. Rivers carved through valleys slowly, as if time itself had not yet learned urgency. Forests stretched endlessly, dense enough to erase paths, erase settlements, erase memory. There was no nation yet, no unified identity, no central command shaping the islands into order. Only scattered human life clinging to geography. Only small communities learning how to survive inside a land that offered no stability. Everything began with clans. Not governments, not armies, just families extended across generations and bound together by necessity. Blood determined belonging. Survival determined leadership. And leadership was never permanent. It belonged to whoever could hold it through strength, protection, or fear. In this early world there were no samurai, not even the idea of them. Violence existed, but it was not structured. It was reactive, immediate, local. A tool of survival rather than identity. But even in this fragmented beginning, change was already approaching from beyond the sea. Across the waters, powerful civilizations in China and Korea had already developed systems of writing, administration, philosophy, and governance. Systems Japan had never fully known before. The idea that power could be organized beyond family ties. That authority could be written, recorded, standardized. And slowly, these ideas crossed into the islands. Not as conquest, not as invasion, but as influence. Japan began absorbing them piece by piece. Writing systems appeared. Religious ideas arrived. Political frameworks began to take root. And from this slow transformation, something began to form. The Yamato clan. At first, just another clan among many. But ambition changes everything it touches. They did not only rule land. They ruled belief. They claimed descent from the heavens. And in doing so, turned authority into something sacred. Power stopped being just strength. It became divine right. And that changed everything. A capital began to rise. A court began to form. A state still fragile, still unfinished, but real enough to reshape history. Records were written. Ranks were created. Taxes were imagined into existence. And for a moment, it looked like control. But control is an illusion built on distance. And Japan is a land built on distance. Mountains broke communication. Rivers delayed orders. Forests erased authority. The court in the center believed it ruled everything. But outside the center, reality disagreed. Far from the capital, land became power. And power became private. Great estates formed. Shun, land without taxes. Land without oversight. Land without true control. And slowly, the emperor's world began to shrink. Not suddenly, not violently, just quietly, like water draining from a bowl. In the capital, life became elegant. Poetry replaced politics. Ritual replaced reality. Beauty replaced urgency. The Heian world became a performance of perfection. Silk silence ceremony. A civilization obsessed with appearance, slowly forgetting consequence. But outside the capital, the world was not poetic. It was unstable. It was violent in small ways, and sometimes in large ones. Land disputes, resource conflicts, local rivalries. And no one coming to solve them. So people stopped waiting and started acting. Men began to rise who did not belong to the court. Men who did not write poetry. Men who did not attend ceremonies. Men who carried weapons instead of ink. At first, they were not a class. Not yet samurai. Just necessity given form. They rode horses. They carried bows. They solved problems directly. Not through law, but through force. And force always becomes structure. In the north, a war sharpened this change. The Emishi resisted expansion. The court sent armies, but the land itself fought back. Forest swallowed formations. Terrain destroyed discipline. And traditional warfare collapsed under geography. So war evolved. It had to. Speed replaced formation. Mobility replaced numbers. Skill replaced tradition. Mounted archers became essential. Striking fast, disappearing faster. Like storms that never stayed long enough to be answered. And in this violence, something new was born. Not ideology. Not culture. But identity. A warrior who belonged to landowners. A warrior who answered to local power. A warrior who existed because central authority failed to reach him. Loyalty changed shape. It was no longer abstract. It became personal. A name. A house. A promise. Not an empire. And slowly, without announcement, without ceremony, Japan's center of gravity began to shift. Away from Kyoto. Away from court. Away from poetry. Toward the provinces. Toward men with weapons. Because power always moves toward enforcement. And enforcement always moves toward whoever can act fastest. The court still believed it ruled. But belief is not control. And in that gap between belief and reality, a new force was forming. Quietly, inevitably, not yet samurai, but already no longer ordinary men. And in the distance of history, two names began to take shape. Minamoto, Taira, not yet rivals, not yet legends, but already moving toward collision. Because Japan was no longer stable. It was shifting from ceremony to conflict, from poetry to power, from silence to steel. And the age of warriors was no longer coming. It had already begun. Japan did not become a land of samurai through a single war or a single moment of collapse. It changed slowly, like pressure building beneath stone, like a system forgetting how to hold itself together. The court in Kyoto still believed it ruled everything. Still believed authority came from ceremony. Still believed distance could not weaken power. But power was already moving away from it, quietly, inevitably, like something slipping out of a hand that refused to notice it was gone. And in that space between belief and reality, two names began to rise. Minamoto, Taira, not yet enemies, not yet legends, but already different from the world that created them. They were born from the same system, but pulled in different directions by the same breaking world. At first, both families still served the imperial court, still accepted appointments, still operated under the illusion of centralized authority. But the illusion was thin, because in the provinces, authority meant nothing without force. And force was no longer in Kyoto. It was elsewhere now, in men who could ride men, who could fight men, who could enforce decisions where letters and decrees had no reach. The Minamoto began to drift toward that reality first. They became increasingly tied to military responsibility, not as a philosophy, but as necessity. They were called upon to suppress rebellions, settle disputes, enforce order in regions the court could no longer control. And each time they acted, their identity shifted further away from the capital. They were becoming something new without naming it. Warriors before the word had weight. The Taira moved differently. More carefully, more politically, more deeply embedded within the court itself. They learned how to survive inside the structure rather than outside it. They gained rank, influence, proximity to the emperor. They became proof that power could still exist through ceremony if one mastered the system from within. Two paths forming inside one collapsing order. One rooted in force. One rooted in proximity. Both unstable. Both temporary. Because the system itself was weakening. Not through invasion. Not through revolution. But through distance. Japan's geography ensured that authority could never be evenly enforced. Mountains divided communication. Rivers slowed travel. Forests erased roads. What the capital saw as control, the provinces experienced as suggestion. And suggestion is not power. It is only expectation. Over time, expectations stopped being enough. Local disputes grew more frequent. Land conflicts intensified. Tax resistance spread quietly through rural estates. And the court responded too slowly, too weakly, too far away. So people stopped waiting. They began to solve problems themselves. Violence filled the gap where law could not reach. But it was not yet chaos. It was structure forming under pressure. Men began organizing around protection, around land, around loyalty to those who could guarantee survival. These men were not yet samurai in the fully formed sense history would later romanticize. But they were the foundation of that identity. Mounted warriors, bowmen on horseback, local enforcers of fragile order. Their loyalty was not ideological. It was personal. It belonged to whoever could provide protection, food, land, survival. Not the emperor, not the abstract state, but the immediate power in front of them. And that shift changed everything. Because once loyalty becomes personal, it becomes mobile. And once it becomes mobile, it becomes political force. In the northern regions, this transformation accelerated dramatically. The Yamato court pushed expansion into territories held by the Emishi people. But the land resisted control in ways administration could not solve. Dense forests made formations useless. Unpredictable terrain broke supply lines. Conventional armies struggled to maintain coherence. And so warfare adapted. It always does. Speed replaced structure. Mobility replaced formation. Mounted archery became dominant. Striking quickly, retreating instantly, avoiding sustained engagement. War became movement rather than collision. And those who mastered movement began to define survival. These mounted fighters were not yet samurai as culture would later define them. But they were becoming the prototype. A new class forming not from decree, but from necessity. From geography. From failure of centralized control. From the inability of the court to project power across distance. And as these warriors became more essential, their status began to rise. Landowners depended on them. Local governors relied on them. Entire regions stabilized around their presence. They were no longer temporary solutions. They were becoming permanent structures. And permanence always leads to hierarchy. A quiet transformation was taking place across Japan. The court still existed, still held symbolic authority, still performed ritual legitimacy. But real control was drifting downward, toward those who could enforce outcomes directly, toward those who could act faster than the system could respond, toward those who carried weapons instead of records. And in that shift, the balance of Japan began to tilt. Slowly, invisibly, but irreversibly. The Minamoto and Taira were now more than powerful families. They were early expressions of a divided future. One side moving toward military dominance, the other moving toward political integration. But neither could remain stable for long, because the system they depended on was already weakening beneath them. Kyoto remained elegant, still filled with poetry, still filled with ritual precision, still believing in permanence. But permanence does not survive fragmentation. Outside the capital, life was different, less symbolic, more immediate. Villages learned to defend themselves. Estates learned to govern without oversight. Local conflicts were resolved not through court judgment, but through force. And force became routine. And routine becomes structure. And structure becomes class. Slowly, without formal declaration, a new social order was forming. One where military ability mattered more than aristocratic lineage in the provinces. One where survival depended on readiness rather than status. One where loyalty was tied to protection rather than ideology. And in that environment, the samurai identity began to emerge. Not as a title, not as a law, but as an outcome of instability, a solution to fragmentation, a response to distance, a necessity shaped into tradition. The court attempted to maintain authority, but every attempt revealed the same truth. Distance weakens control, and Japan is defined by distance. Mountains separated authority. Rivers slowed communication. Roads broke continuity. So the center could not hold everything. And when a center cannot hold, power redistributes itself. Not evenly, not peacefully, but inevitably. Minamoto and Taira now stood at the edge of something larger than themselves. Not yet war, not yet collapse, but pressure building toward both. They were no longer just families within a system. They were indicators of a system nearing its breaking point. And beneath everything, the question was forming more clearly now. Not spoken in courts, not written in records, but understood in silence. Who truly governs Japan? The emperor who represents order, or the warriors who enforce it? That question would not remain theoretical for long, because systems built on ceremony eventually meet systems built on force. And force does not negotiate with illusion. It replaces it. The age of balance was ending, and the age of confrontation was beginning. Japan was no longer quietly changing. It was accelerating toward collapse. The old balance between court authority and provincial power was gone now, even if no one in Kyoto fully admitted it yet. Power had already slipped into the hands of those who could enforce it. And enforcement always demands conflict. Not eventually, immediately. The tension that had been building for generations finally found its release. And it would be remembered as the war that defined an era. The Genpei War. But at its beginning, it was not seen as destiny. It was seen as politics. A dispute. A reaction. A correction of imbalance that no one yet understood could not be corrected. The court still believed it was managing rivalries. Still believed clans were tools of order. still believed violence could be controlled through appointment and reward. But the system was no longer strong enough to control anything. It could only react. And reaction is already weakness. The Minamoto and Taira were no longer just influential families. They had become gravitational forces, pulling allies into orbit, pulling regions into alignment, pulling Japan toward division. The Taira reached the height of their political dominance first. They embedded themselves deeply within the imperial court. They controlled appointments. They influenced succession. They stood closest to the emperor himself. From the outside, it looked like stability. From the inside, it was dependency disguised as control. Because the Taira did not rule Japan. They ruled proximity to power. And proximity is fragile. The Minamoto, meanwhile, were being pushed further outward, into military responsibility, into provincial warfare, into conflicts the court no longer understood in detail. And with every campaign, they became less connected to the capital, and more connected to the battlefield. Two clans, two directions, one inside the court, one outside it, both moving toward collision. The breaking point came with imperial succession disputes, a struggle over legitimacy, over influence, over who controlled the symbolic heart of Japan. And in that struggle, alliances shattered. Families chose sides. Temples aligned politically. Provinces fractured into loyalty networks. What began as court politics became national war almost overnight. But Japan was not a nation yet. So the war was not national. It was total fragmentation. The first clashes were small. Local engagements, raids, ambushes, skirmishes that tested strength rather than deciding outcomes. But each battle widened the divide. Each confrontation forced neutrality to disappear. In times of war, neutrality is the first casualty. Minamoto forces adapted quickly. Their strength came from mobility and provincial support. They understood terrain. They understood speed. They understood that victory was not about holding ground, but breaking enemy coordination. The Taira relied on structure and political authority. They still believed central control could stabilize the situation. But war does not respect administrative confidence. War rewards adaptability and punishes expectation. As conflict expanded, entire regions were drawn in. Families that had no interest in imperial politics were forced to choose sides, not based on ideology, but based on survival. Because war does not ask what you believe. It asks who can protect you and who cannot. Battles became more than military engagements. They became social reorganizations. Every defeat reshaped loyalty networks. Every victory redefined regional control. And beneath it all, the idea of samurai identity hardened further. Not as romantic warriors, but as professionals of violence. Men train not for glory, but for function, for enforcement, for survival in a collapsing order. The war moved across land and sea. Castles became important. Fortified positions replaced open field assumptions. Naval battles emerged as critical turning points. Japan was learning warfare through necessity, not design. And every lesson was paid for in blood. Among the most famous figures of this era rose from the Minamoto side. Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a figure later mythologized beyond reality. but in his time, a commander of extraordinary mobility and tactical brilliance. He embodied the new logic of war. Fast movement, unpredictable strikes, psychological pressure on enemy formations. He did not fight wars as rituals. He fought them as systems to be broken. And as his campaigns succeeded, the terror began to fracture internally. Because no political structure survives prolonged military pressure without cracking. Trust erodes. Leadership becomes contested. Fear replaces coordination. And once fear enters command structure, collapse begins from within. The final confrontation came at sea. At Dan no Ura, a battle that symbolized more than naval dominance. It symbolized the end of an era. Ships collided not just as vessels of war, but as carriers of political destiny. The Taira fought with desperation. The Minamoto fought with inevitability. And inevitability always wins. The tides turned against the Taira. Not metaphorically, literally. The sea itself shifted the battle. And in that moment, history closed one chapter and opened another. The Taira leadership was destroyed. Their political structure collapsed. Their influence erased almost overnight. But war does not end cleanly. It rarely ends completely. Survivors remained. Loyalties lingered. And the consequences of collapse spread far beyond the battlefield. The Minamoto emerged victorious. But victory in civil war is not stability. It is only dominance of the moment. And dominance always demands structure afterward. From this victory, a new political order began to form. Military governance. Rule enforced not by court ritual, but by warrior authority. The first true shogunate system began to emerge. Not yet fully defined, but undeniably present. Japan had crossed a threshold. The emperor still existed, still symbolized legitimacy, but real governance had moved elsewhere, into the hands of those who fought, into the hands of those who enforced, into the hands of those who survived. The age of court dominance was over, and the age of warrior rule had begun. Not as myth, not as philosophy, but as reality carved through conflict. And Japan would never return to what it was before. Japan had changed shape through war. But war does not end systems, it replaces them. And what rose after the Genpei conflict was not peace, but structure built from violence. A new form of government was forming. Not in Kyoto, but in Kamakura. Far from the elegant court, far from poetry and ceremony, a military center began to define what Japan had become. The Minamoto had won the war. But winning a war is not the same as ruling a country. Because victory destroys enemies. But governance must control everything else. And everything else was still unstable. Minamoto no Yoritomo understood this better than anyone. He did not trust the court. He did not trust inherited ceremony. He trusted only enforcement. And enforcement must be organized, systemized, permanent. So a new political structure was created. The shogunate, a government built on military authority. Not symbolic legitimacy, but actual control. Power enforced through land, loyalty, and armed retainers. For the first time, Japan had two centers. The emperor in Kyoto, representing tradition, and the shogun in Kamakura, representing reality. Two systems occupying the same land. But only one held force. And force defines hierarchy. The shogunate was not a sudden invention. It was the formalization of what had already been happening for generations. Local warriors had already been replacing court authority in the provinces. Now that reality was made official, the samurai class was no longer emerging. It was now recognized, structured, integrated into governance. But recognition did not mean stability. It meant responsibility. And responsibility required control mechanisms. Land was reorganized. Loyalty was recorded. Military service became the foundation of authority. Those who fought were rewarded with estates. Those who controlled estates provided soldiers. A cycle formed. A system hardened. A new order replaced the old one. But beneath this structure, tension remained. Because the court still existed, still symbolized divine authority, still claimed ultimate legitimacy, even if it no longer held real power. This duality defined Japan moving forward. One ruler of spirit, one ruler of force, one existing in ceremony, one existing in reality, and both needed each other even as they competed. The early shogunate relied heavily on vassal relationships. Samurai did not serve a distant state. They served personal bonds. Lords, patrons, households. Loyalty was not abstract. It was contractual and fragile, because contracts break when pressure rises. To stabilize the system, legal codes were introduced. Rules governing land disputes, inheritance, military obligation, not to create equality, but to maintain hierarchy. Order was not fairness. Order was control. And control required structure. But structure also revealed inequality. Power concentrated quickly in certain families, certain regions, certain military houses. And as power concentrated, resentment grew quietly beneath it. Meanwhile, samurai identity began to solidify further. They were no longer just provincial fighters. They were now administrators, enforcers, governors of land on behalf of military authority. Their role expanded beyond combat. They became the backbone of governance itself. But their world was still defined by instability. Because loyalty could shift, patronage could end, land could be revoked. Nothing was permanent, except violence. And violence remained the final guarantee of authority. Religious influence also adapted to this new order. Zen Buddhism began to spread among warrior classes, not as doctrine alone, but as psychological discipline. Control of fear, control of emotion, control of death itself. Because a system built on warfare must also build systems to survive warfare mentally. The samurai were not just soldiers. They were becoming a psychological class, trained to accept impermanence, trained to detach from outcome, trained to function under constant threat. And this mindset began to reshape culture itself. Art became simpler. Philosophy became sharper. Discipline became identity. But beneath this refinement, the political system remained fragile. Because Kamakura rule depended on constant balance between loyalty and reward, between authority and autonomy, between central control and local power. And balance is always temporary in systems built on force. Regional lords grew stronger over time. Some accumulated wealth. Some expanded influence. Some began acting independently. The shogunate had replaced the court as the center of power, but it had not eliminated fragmentation. It had only reorganized it. And Japan remained a country defined by distance. Geographic distance, political distance, emotional distance between authority and obedience. Over time, this distance would grow again. Slowly, quietly, until pressure builds once more, and the system begins to strain. But for now, Kamakura stood as the symbol of a new reality. A world where warriors were no longer outsiders, where violence was institutionalized, where samurai were not just fighters, but the structure of the nation itself. And yet, history was already preparing its next collapse. Because every system built on force eventually meets a stronger force. And no structure remains permanent in a land shaped by fragmentation. The age of court rule had ended, but the age of warrior rule had only just begun. The Kamakura system was not built to last forever. It was built to control a fractured world. And fractured worlds never stay still. For a time, it worked. Japan was governed by warriors now. The shogunate held authority. Samurai enforced order. The court remained in Kyoto silent, ceremonial, still respected, but no longer decisive. But beneath this balance, pressure was building again. Slowly, quietly, like something waiting behind stone. And then the world outside Japan moved. The Mongol Empire expanded across continents like a force without limits. Kublai Khan had already reshaped China, already crushed resistance across Asia, already absorbed kingdoms into a system of overwhelming scale. And now his attention turned to Japan. Japan was not seen as a peer, not even as a rival. It was seen as a target of submission, an island expected to bend like everything else had bent before it. Messages were sent. Demands were issued. Submission or invasion. The Kamakura shogunate refused. Not through diplomacy, not through negotiation, but through silence. And silence, in the face of an empire like the Mongols, is a challenge. The first invasion came like a storm that had crossed too much land to hesitate. Mongol forces arrived with Chinese and Korean auxiliaries. They brought new tactics, new weapons, new scale of warfare, gunpowder bombs, coordinated infantry formations, mass psychological warfare. Japan had never seen anything like it. Samurai warfare was built on individual skill, on duels, on mounted archery, on controlled engagements between known opponents. The Mongols did not fight like that. They fought as systems, as waves, as overwhelming coordination. Early battles shocked the Japanese forces. Samurai expected duels. They received chaos. They expected honor. They received strategy without hesitation. And yet, the Mongols were not invincible. Because Japan had something the Mongols did not understand. The land itself. Storms gathered over the sea. Weather shifted violently. Naval conditions became unpredictable. And then something decisive happened. A massive storm struck the invasion fleet. Ships were destroyed. Troops were drowned. Coordination collapsed. The invasion failed. Not through pure military victory, but through environment. Nature itself intervened. The Japanese would later call it divine wind. Kamikaze. A wind that protected the islands. A wind that became legend. But at the time, it was survival. Unplanned, uncontrolled, absolute. The Mongols would attempt invasion again later. And again, they would fail. But the psychological impact remained. Because Japan had faced something beyond its own understanding of war. A system of warfare that did not rely on honor, or individual combat, or controlled engagement, but total coordination on a scale Japan had never experienced. And this changed everything. The samurai system began to feel pressure internally. Because victory against the Mongols was not decisive in a structural sense. It did not bring new land. It did not bring wealth proportional to effort. It did not stabilize governance. It only proved survival. And survival without reward creates instability. The Kamakura shogunate began to strain. Rewards for warriors were insufficient. Land distribution became contested. Loyalty began to weaken. Because warriors expected compensation for war. And war against the Mongols had been costly. Very costly. The system that had once balanced control now began to tilt. Economic pressure grew. Political dissatisfaction increased. Regional lords gained more independence. The shogunate's authority began to weaken slowly, almost invisibly at first. But consistently. And history rarely needs speed to collapse systems. It only needs persistence. Meanwhile, the idea of samurai identity continued to evolve. They were no longer simply battlefield warriors. They were now political actors, landholders, administrators, power brokers within a decentralized military state. Their role expanded beyond combat into governance itself. But expansion always creates complexity. And complexity always creates fracture. As Kamakura authority weakened, internal conflict began to rise. Competing claims, political rivalries, factional disputes within the warrior class itself. The system that had once unified military power now began to divide it. And division is the beginning of collapse. Even the emperor in Kyoto began to sense opportunity again. Not through direct power, but through shifting instability. Because when warrior systems fracture, symbolic systems begin to reassert themselves. And Japan was once again entering a moment where authority was uncertain. Not because power disappeared, but because it was no longer concentrated. And distributed power is always unstable. The Mongol invasions had done more than test Japan's defenses. They had exposed the limits of the shogunate system itself. They had shown that survival did not guarantee stability. And stability was the real foundation of governance. Without it, everything becomes temporary. And Kamakura, once strong, once decisive, once revolutionary, was beginning to weaken under its own contradictions. The age of Mongol invasions ended. But what remained was not peace. It was imbalance. And imbalance always moves toward correction. One way or another. Kamakura had survived invasion from beyond Japan, but it could not survive itself, because external enemies test strength, but internal fractures decide fate. Japan, after the Mongol invasions, was no longer held together by certainty, only by pressure, only by memory of survival, only by a system that was beginning to lose control of the very warriors it had created. The shogunate had been built to unify military power, but over time, that power had spread too far to contain. Regional lords grew stronger, samurai families became independent forces, loyalty began to shift again. Not toward the shogun, not toward the emperor, but toward personal ambition and personal survival. The crisis did not begin as war. It began as doubt. Doubt in rewards, doubt in authority, doubt in whether Kamakura could still hold the balance it once created. Warriors who had survived the Mongol invasions expected compensation, land, titles, security, but the system was stretched too thin to satisfy everyone, and dissatisfaction spreads faster than loyalty ever does. The shogunate tried to respond through administration. Land disputes were regulated, rewards were reassessed, authority was reasserted through law, but law only works when power supports it fully, and power was already dispersing. Meanwhile, Kyoto was not gone. The imperial court still existed, still observed, still waited. Because when military systems weaken, symbolic systems begin to breathe again. And Emperor Go-Daigo understood this. He believed the imperial institution could reclaim direct rule, that the age of warriors was not permanent, that Kamakura was not destiny, only interruption. So he acted, not with armies at first, but with alliances, with loyalty networks, with political momentum building outside Kamakura's control. A different kind of war was beginning. Not steel against steel, but legitimacy against structure. And legitimacy is dangerous when structure is weakening. The conflict that followed was not immediate collapse, it was fragmentation. Samurai families began choosing sides, regional lords reconsidered loyalty, the illusion of unity began to break apart into competing centers of power. And Kamakura, once the heart of warrior governance, began to fracture from within. But the true turning point was not rebellion. It was betrayal. Because the most powerful figures in any system are often the first to decide it no longer serves them. Ashikaga Takoji was one of those figures. A commander within the Kamakura military order, trusted, positioned at the center of enforcement, a man who understood both loyalty and opportunity. And when he was sent to suppress imperial forces, he made a decision that changed everything. He changed sides, not out of passion, but calculation. And that single shift shattered Kamakura authority more effectively than any external enemy could. Because systems do not collapse only when attacked. They collapse when their own structure turns inward. With Ashikaga's defection, the balance broke. Imperial forces gained momentum. Kamakura forces lost cohesion. Alliances dissolved under pressure. Authority stopped being unified. And once authority is no longer unified, it stops being authority. It becomes competing claims. The fall of Kamakura was not a single battle. It was a breakdown of coordination. Samurai loyalties fractured, command chains failed, regional leaders acted independently. The system that had once centralized warrior power could no longer direct it. And so it dissolved. Not dramatically, but completely. Kamakura fell, not because it was conquered in one moment, but because it could no longer hold belief in itself. And legitimacy is the only thing military systems truly depend on. Without it, force becomes scattered violence, governance becomes memory, and order becomes temporary. But Japan did not return to unity. It moved into something more unstable. Competing claims of legitimacy emerged. The emperor attempted restoration. Warrior families competed for control. Regions acted independently. And soon two courts would emerge, northern and southern, each claiming rightful authority, each supported by different military powers, each convinced it represented order itself. Japan had not stabilized after collapse. It had multiplied authority instead. And multiplication of authority always leads to conflict. The fall of Kamakura did not end the samurai system. It revealed it. It exposed the truth that had always existed beneath structure. That power in Japan was no longer centralized. It was distributed. And distributed power never remains peaceful for long. Because every center believes it is rightful. And every claim demands enforcement. From this collapse, a new age was already forming in the distance. An age far more violent, far more fragmented, far more unstable. And Japan, once again, was standing at the edge of transformation. Japan did not settle after the fall of Kamakura, it split. Not into silence, but into competing claims of reality. Because when one authority collapses, what remains is not unity. It is struggle over what comes next. Two courts now existed at the same time. The Northern Court, the Southern Court, both claiming legitimacy, both claiming the throne represented true continuity, both claiming Japan itself belonged to them. But claims mean nothing without enforcement. And enforcement was no longer centralized. It was scattered across warrior families, shifting alliances, and regional power blocks that no longer waited for permission. Japan had become a country of overlapping truths, and none of them could fully dominate the others. The Ashikaga rose from this fragmentation, not as restorers of order, but as navigators of instability. Ashikaga Takoji understood something the old Kamakura system had failed to grasp. Power is not inherited. It is controlled in motion, through alliances, through force, through timing. So when he established the new shogunate, it was not a return to stability. It was an attempt to manage permanent instability. A system built on contradiction from the beginning. A military government that ruled a country that no longer agreed on what rule meant. Kyoto remained the symbolic center. Still sacred, still imperial, still performing legitimacy through ritual and tradition. But its authority now depended on military backing that shifted constantly. The emperor ruled in name, but names do not enforce obedience. Swords do, and swords belonged elsewhere. In the provinces, real power expanded quietly. Local warlords strengthened their positions. Landholdings grew more independent. Taxation became fragmented. Every region began to operate as its own small political universe. Connected but not unified. Japan had become a network of powers rather than a single system. And networks do not obey central control easily. The Ashikaga shogunate tried to stabilize this reality. But stabilization required resources it did not fully possess. It relied on alliances that could break at any time. It depended on loyalty that shifted with opportunity. And it governed through a system that rewarded independence even while demanding obedience. This contradiction could not last forever, but it lasted long enough to shape an entire age. The period that followed was not defined by decisive wars. It was defined by constant tension, a slow-burning instability where conflicts erupted, resolved, and re-emerged elsewhere. No single victory could end the cycle, because the system itself was fragmented. Castles evolved during this time, not as royal residences, but as instruments of survival. They became layered structures of defense and control, centers of administration and military readiness combined. Every castle became a statement, a declaration that authority here was local, not central. Samurai identity continued to evolve within this fractured system. They were no longer just warriors serving a lord. They were administrators of land, managers of resources, enforcers of fragile order in regions where authority could disappear overnight. Their role expanded beyond combat. They became the operating system of regional governance. But with expansion came instability, because loyalty in a fractured system is never permanent. It is transactional, conditional, always open to renegotiation. Zen Buddhism gained deeper influence among warrior culture during this era, not as religion alone, but as psychological structure, a way to accept impermanence without collapse, a way to function in a world where nothing remained stable for long. Detachment became discipline. Control of emotion became survival strategy. And acceptance of death became part of identity formation. But even philosophy could not stabilize the political reality, because the underlying structure of Japan remained divided. Authority existed in layers that often conflicted with each other. The emperor, the shogun, regional lords, local commanders, each level dependent on the others, yet competing with them at the same time. It was not unity. It was managed fragmentation. And managed fragmentation always trends toward collapse when pressure increases. That pressure was already building quietly, through economic strain, through succession disputes, through shifting alliances, through ambitions that no central authority could fully control. The Ashikaga system held Japan together, but loosely, like threads stretched across distance rather than a solid frame. And threads eventually fray. But for now, the system endured. Not because it was strong, but because nothing strong enough had yet emerged to replace it. Japan remained suspended between order and chaos, between unity and division, between imperial symbolism and military reality. And beneath it all, the country was preparing for a far more violent transformation, one that would no longer be defined by dual courts, but by total fragmentation, where even regional order would break apart, and every domain would become its own battlefield. The age of controlled instability was nearing its limit, and something far more chaotic was approaching. Japan was no longer held together by a center of power. It was held together by tension, and tension always seeks release. The Ashikaga shogunate still existed, but it was fading. Authority no longer commanded obedience. It negotiated for it. Power was no longer flowing upward. It was breaking outward, into regions, into families, into warlords who no longer waited for permission. They only needed opportunity. And Japan was full of it. The system did not collapse suddenly. It dissolved in fragments, one failure at a time, one dispute at a time, one broken command at a time. Land disputes that could not be resolved, inheritance conflicts that turned into violence, regional governors ignoring orders from Kyoto. Each failure added pressure, until pressure became instability, and instability became structure, not order, but organized fragmentation. The shogun still ruled in name. The emperor still represented legitimacy, but neither could enforce control across Japan. And authority without enforcement is only symbolism. In the provinces, power changed form. New rulers emerged, not appointed, not sanctioned, not inherited through ceremony. They were daimyo, regional warlords, men who ruled land through force, not recognition. They were not outside the system. They were what the system had become. Castles spread across Japan, not as decoration, not as prestige, but as survival mechanisms. each one a command center, each one a fortress, each one a declaration of control. Villages clustered around them, trade routes bent around them, entire regions reorganized around military reality. Walls thickened, defenses multiplied. Life became structured around protection. Because in this world, safety was not assumed. It was built. The Ashikaga shogunate tried to respond. Through appointments, through negotiation, through fragile compromise. But compromise requires trust in authority. And trust was disappearing. Every decision was contested. Every ruling questioned. Every appointment political risk. The center weakened each time it acted. Meanwhile, the daimyo grew stronger. Not evenly, but inevitably. Each one expanding territory. Each one consolidating power. Each one building armies independent of Kyoto. Loyalty changed shape again. It was no longer abstract. Not imperial. Not universal. It became local. Tied to survival within a domain. Tied to protection. Tied to immediate power. War became constant, but not unified. Fragmented violence across the country. Border skirmishes. Raids. Assassinations. Sudden betrayals. Quiet expansions disguised as defense. Peace no longer existed as a national condition. Only temporary pauses between conflicts. Japan had become a field of competing powers. Not one war, but many overlapping ones. And beneath this fragmentation, pressure continued to build. Because every local warlord wanted expansion. Every domain wanted security. Every alliance was temporary. And temporary systems always move toward escalation. The age of controlled instability was ending. And something far more violent was forming beneath it. A system where even regional balance would break down. Where survival itself would require expansion. Where war would no longer be local, but national. Japan no longer had a single conflict. It had become conflict itself. What once was a fragmented political system had now collapsed into full instability. Not controlled instability. Not managed division, but open competition between every surviving center of power. The Ashikaga shogunate still existed in Kyoto, but it no longer commanded Japan. It survived inside it. Barely. The daimyo no longer waited for permission. They no longer appealed to the center for legitimacy. They only measured strength against other strength. And strength had become the only language that mattered. For decades, pressure had been building inside the system. Disputes over succession. Disputes over land. Disputes over honor that no authority could resolve. Each unresolved conflict added weight to an already fractured structure, until the structure could no longer contain itself. Then came the break. The Onin War. It did not begin as a national war. It began as a succession dispute inside the shogunate family. A question of inheritance. A question of legitimacy. A question the system was no longer strong enough to settle peacefully. Two rival claimants. Two opposing factions. And a capital that became the first battlefield of a new age. Kyoto was no longer a symbol of unity. It became a map of division. Streets turned into front lines. Districts became factional territory. Temples became military bases. The war did not stay contained. because nothing in Japan could stay contained anymore. Daimyo from across the country entered the conflict, not out of loyalty to Kyoto, but to position themselves for advantage, for expansion, for survival in the chaos that was forming. And once they entered, they did not leave. The war stopped being about succession. It stopped being about the shogunate. It stopped being about Kyoto. It became a national unraveling. All remaining authority structures began to collapse under the weight of participation. All alliances became temporary. All agreements became tactical. Even trust became dangerous. The Ashikaga shogunate lost all real control during the conflict, not because it was directly destroyed, but because everyone stopped treating it as final authority. Authority that is ignored is already gone. It just takes time to fall completely. Kyoto itself suffered devastation. Not just physical destruction, but symbolic collapse. The center of Japan's old political identity was reduced to a contested ruin. And when the capital becomes a battlefield, the idea of a capital begins to die. After the Onin War, Japan did not return to order. It returned to absence of order. The system did not reform. It disintegrated. The country fragmented further into autonomous domains, each ruled by a daimyo, each pursuing its own survival, each prepared for permanent conflict. This was the beginning of the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. But calling it a period is misleading. It was not a phase between systems. It was a system with no center. War became continuous, not large coordinated campaigns, but overlapping struggles across every region. Borders shifted constantly. Alliances formed and broke within years, sometimes months, sometimes weeks. Loyalty was no longer stable enough to define identity. It was conditional, transactional, reversible. Samurai identity changed again under this pressure. They were no longer just warriors serving a lord. They became mobile instruments of power. Soldiers, administrators, strategists, and negotiators all at once. Their existence was tied to survival within chaos, not order within hierarchy. Castles multiplied even further, not as symbols of power, but as necessities of survival in a land where no region could be trusted to remain stable. Every castle was a warning. Every wall was a prediction of betrayal. Every fortress was a statement that peace could not be assumed. Technology and warfare evolved rapidly under constant pressure. Sieges became more common. Firearms would later begin to appear and shift the balance again. Logistics became as important as combat. War was no longer about single battles. It was about systems of endurance. And endurance defined success. Entire clans rose and fell within a generation. Some expanded rapidly through conquest. Others collapsed just as quickly through internal betrayal or external pressure. There was no stable hierarchy anymore. Only temporary dominance. And temporary dominance always leads to ambition. Because success in chaos teaches expansion. And expansion always creates enemies. Japan had become a landscape of competing futures. No single direction. No unified outcome. Only overlapping attempts to impose order on a system that refused to settle. The Ashikaga shogunate still existed in name, but it was no longer the center of anything. It was simply one actor among many. And the emperor remained in Kyoto. still symbolic, still sacred, still distant from real power. But symbolism alone could not stabilize a fractured country. By now, Japan was fully inside the logic of the Sengoku age, a world where survival depended on constant readiness, where peace was temporary, where war was default. And beneath all of it, something new was forming. Not unity, not restoration, but consolidation through overwhelming force. Because in systems that fragment completely, only the strongest structures survive long enough to rebuild anything. And Japan was now moving toward figures who could do exactly that. Men who would not just participate in chaos, but end it. Japan had reached a point where fragmentation was no longer growing. It was complete. The Sengoku period was not becoming more chaotic. It had already achieved maximum fragmentation. Now it was simply sustaining itself through constant conflict. Every domain was independent. Every daimyo was a sovereign force. Every alliance was temporary by design. There was no center left to collapse. Only competing ambitions trying to outlast each other. And in this environment, a new kind of power began to emerge. Not born from tradition, not inherited through court legitimacy, but built through absolute consolidation. The logic of survival had changed. Before, survival meant holding territory. Now survival meant expanding it before others could. Stagnation was death. Movement was survival. And this principle reshaped everything. Daimyo who could organize efficiently began to dominate those who relied on older systems of loyalty. Armies became more structured. Command became more centralized within domains. Administration became as important as battlefield success. War was no longer just fighting. It was logistics, supply, control of resources, control of movement. And those who understood this began to rise above others. Among the many competing powers, certain clans began to stand out. Not because they were invincible, but because they adapted faster than others. Oda Nobunaga was one of these figures. He did not emerge as a symbolic leader. He emerged as a disruptor. He rejected the idea that tradition could stabilize Japan. He understood that tradition was part of the fragmentation itself. So he broke it. Not gradually, not cautiously, but directly. He reorganized military structure. He prioritized effectiveness over lineage. He used new tactics that ignored older samurai conventions. Firearms began to change warfare under his influence, not as novelty, but as practical advantage. The battlefield was no longer defined by individual skill alone. It was defined by coordination, discipline, and technological adaptation. This shifted the entire identity of samurai warfare. No longer duels between elite warriors, but coordinated systems of violence, groups over individuals, strategy over honor, efficiency over tradition. And this change created winners and losers at scale. Clans that refused adaptation collapsed quickly. Clans that embraced it expanded rapidly. The Sengoku period rewarded transformation. But transformation also destroyed stability. Because every improvement in warfare increased pressure on all remaining systems. Oda Nobunaga's rise was not just military. It was structural. He targeted institutions that still held independent authority outside daimyo control. Religious power centers, monasteries with armed forces, fortified temple networks that acted like political entities. These were not symbolic targets. They were competing centers of power. And in a fragmented system, every center is a threat. So they were removed, not out of ideology, but out of necessity within a logic of consolidation. As Nobunaga expanded, Japan began to experience a different kind of instability. Not fragmentation anymore, but forced unification through domination. Territories were absorbed, rivals eliminated, alliances broken once they were no longer useful. This was not restoration of order. It was reduction of chaos through force. But even this approach had limits, because conquest creates resistance, and resistance creates new coalitions. The Sengoku period did not end easily. It adapted to each attempt at domination by producing new opposition. And yet, the pattern of consolidation continued. Because the logic of the era had changed. Only large-scale unification could end large-scale fragmentation. But large-scale unification required extraordinary force. And extraordinary force always creates dependency on individuals capable of wielding it. Japan was slowly moving toward central figures who could break the cycle itself. Not just dominate regions, but unify systems. Not just win battles, but end fragmentation as a structure. The samurai class was now fully transformed. They were no longer simply warriors of honor or local enforcers. They were components of large military machines. Identity was now tied to hierarchy within expanding domains rather than traditional codes. And hierarchy was fluid. It could be gained, lost, rebuilt, replaced. Nothing remained fixed. Only motion, only conflict, only adaptation. The Ashikaga shogunate still existed in name during parts of this period, but it no longer shaped events in any meaningful way. It was background, a reminder of a previous system that could not survive the logic of fragmentation. And the emperor remained in Kyoto, still present, still symbolic, still outside the mechanism of power. But symbolism no longer determined outcomes. Force did. By now, Japan had entered a final stage of internal evolution within the Sengoku age. The question was no longer whether the country would remain divided. It was whether someone would eventually be strong enough to end division entirely. And that possibility was beginning to take form in leaders who were not yet finished, but already changing the structure of war itself. Japan was no longer searching for balance. Balance had already failed. The Sengoku period was now fully defined by one principle: consolidate or disappear. Every domain understood it. Every daimyo lived it. Every battlefield proved it again and again. Power did not stabilize. It expanded or it collapsed. There was no middle ground left. And in this environment, Oda Nobunaga's campaign changed scale again. He was no longer just a regional force. He was becoming a system breaker. A man who did not simply win battles, but dismantled the conditions that allowed his enemies to exist. Traditional structures were no longer treated as neutral background. They were treated as obstacles. And obstacles were removed. Religious institutions that had once operated as political and military centers were crushed when they resisted central authority. Not because religion itself was the target, but because independent armed power could not exist in a system moving toward unification. Every independent node had to be absorbed or destroyed. That was the logic of the age. And Nobunaga enforced that logic without hesitation. As his power expanded, the shape of warfare shifted again. Armies were no longer small elite groups of samurai alone. They became large, coordinated forces. Infantry formations expanded. Firearms became increasingly important. Discipline mattered more than individual reputation. The battlefield became mechanical in nature, less personal, more systemic. This changed the identity of the samurai even further. They were no longer defined by singular combat skill. They were defined by their position within organized military structures. Command chains mattered more than personal prowess. Strategy mattered more than individual honor. And survival depended on adaptation to centralized command. Japan was being rebuilt from constant war into structured domination. But that structure was still incomplete, because Nobunaga did not finish the unification himself. His campaign created momentum, not completion. And momentum in a fragmented system always transfers to whoever is closest to it when the original force stops. That transition would define the next phase of Japanese history. Because after Nobunaga came Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a man not defined by noble birth, not defined by traditional legitimacy, but defined by ascent through merit, strategy, and political intelligence. Hideyoshi understood something critical about the Sengoku system. Force alone was not enough to unify Japan. Force created conquest, but conquest without administration collapses into repetition of war. So he changed the objective, from domination to consolidation, from expansion to integration. He continued Nobunaga's unification campaigns, but added structure where only violence had existed before. He began regulating land ownership across domains. He attempted to categorize society more clearly. Warriors, farmers, artisans, merchants. Not as equality, but as control. A system where mobility between classes was reduced to stabilize governance. This was not freedom. It was order imposed after fragmentation. And it worked partially. Japan began to experience something it had not known for generations. Relative stability. Not peace in the absolute sense, but reduced fragmentation under centralized authority. Castles remained important, but they now functioned within a broader unified structure. Armies still existed, but they were now under a central command system. The daimyo was still powerful, but their independence was increasingly restricted. Japan was being compressed from many competing centers into one dominant framework. But this process was not complete, because consolidation always creates external ambition. And Hideyoshi's ambition extended beyond Japan itself. He turned attention toward Korea, and from there toward China, an attempt to extend Japanese power beyond its historical limits. But this expansion exposed a critical truth. A unified Japan was not yet stable enough to sustain external conquest at scale. Supply lines stretched too far. Resources became strained. Resistance outside Japan was stronger than expected. And the system began to show limits again. Even centralized power has boundaries, especially when built from recent fragmentation. Hideyoshi's campaigns did not collapse Japan internally, but they revealed that unification was still incomplete, still dependent on strong leadership, still vulnerable to transition. And leadership is always temporary. As Hideyoshi aged, the question of succession emerged. And within that question, the next transformation was already forming. Because systems built on strong individuals always face instability when those individuals disappear. And Japan was about to enter exactly that moment. A transition from one unifier to another. From consolidation to institutional permanence. From military dominance to structured governance that could survive beyond a single leader. And that next phase would be defined by a man who understood patience more than expansion, and control more than conquest. Japan had been pulled out of fragmentation, not fully stabilized, but no longer endlessly breaking apart. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had forced a kind of national structure onto the chaos of the Sengoku world. Not through tradition, not through inherited legitimacy, but through consolidation of power so complete that resistance became increasingly difficult to sustain. Yet even the strongest consolidation built on one man carries an unavoidable weakness. It depends on that man continuing to exist. And when he does not, everything beneath him begins to shift again. Hideyoshi's authority held Japan together through force, organization, and political restructuring. He reduced the independence of the daimyo. He controlled land distribution. He enforced a rigid social hierarchy to stabilize the country after generations of war. But beneath the surface, nothing had become truly permanent. The daimyo still existed. The military structure still depended on loyalty networks. And loyalty, in Japan's history, had always been conditional. When Hideyoshi's life began to reach its final years, the system he built started to feel the pressure of uncertainty. Because succession was not just a political question. It was a structural one. Who holds Japan together when the holder is gone? That question had already destroyed previous systems. And it would do so again. Among the most powerful figures positioned for what came next was Tokugawa Ieyasu. Unlike many warlords of the Sengoku era, he was not defined by rapid expansion or constant aggression. He was defined by patience, observation, long-term positioning. He survived the chaos not by dominating every moment, but by enduring it. And endurance in unstable systems is its own form of power. When Hideyoshi died, the fragile unity of Japan did not immediately collapse. It hesitated, because the system still contained structure, still contained rules, still contained momentum from consolidation. But momentum without a central force eventually disperses. And that dispersion began to manifest as political tension among the remaining powerful clans. Different factions began to position themselves for influence over the future. Not just loyalty to Hideyoshi's memory, but control over what came after him. The country did not immediately return to full Sengoku fragmentation. Instead, it entered a suspended state, a temporary equilibrium built on competing ambitions. And in that equilibrium, Tokugawa Ieyasu positioned himself carefully. He did not rush. He did not overextend. He did not declare dominance prematurely. He watched the system shift, and he waited for the moment when it would reveal its instability fully. That moment came at Sekigahara, a conflict that would decide not just a battle, but the direction of Japan's entire political structure. It was not the largest battle in terms of duration, but it was decisive in its outcome, because it forced every remaining major power to choose alignment. Neutrality was no longer possible, and in systems nearing consolidation, forcing choice is itself a form of control. The battlefield became a concentration of Japan's fractured loyalties. Eastern and Western coalitions formed around competing visions of authority. One side representing continuity of Toyotomi influence. The other side representing a rising structure under Tokugawa leadership. But unlike earlier Sengoku conflicts, this was not about expansion alone. It was about final control of the system itself. When the battle was decided, it was not just one faction that lost. It was the entire possibility of continued fragmentation. Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory did not immediately erase all opposition, but it removed the structural balance that allowed opposition to remain equal. From that moment forward, the direction of Japan changed, not toward more war, but toward enforced stability. Ieyasu began constructing a system designed to prevent another Sengoku collapse. Land redistribution was carefully managed. Daimyo were categorized by loyalty and proximity. Major domains were strategically placed to prevent unified rebellion. Political movement was controlled through regulation of travel and residence. The samurai class was redefined again. Now they were not just warriors. They were retainers within a highly structured hierarchy. Their role became administrative as much as military. And the country that had once been defined by constant war began to enter a long period of controlled peace. Not because conflict disappeared, but because it was contained. The Tokugawa shogunate marked the beginning of a new era, one where Japan would no longer be fragmented into competing states, but unified under strict hierarchical order. The emperor remained in Kyoto, still symbolic, still sacred, still outside direct governance, but now fully separated from political power. The shogun in Edo held real authority, and beneath him, a carefully managed system of daimyo ensured no single regional power could challenge the center again. Japan had been rebuilt, not into freedom, not into equality, but into stability through control. And after centuries of fragmentation, war, and reconstruction, the country finally entered a sustained period of internal peace. But that peace was not natural. It was engineered. And all engineered systems carry tension beneath their surface. Because what is controlled is not eliminated. It is contained. And containment always carries the possibility of pressure returning. But for now, Japan had entered a new world. A world defined not by fragmentation, but by order. Japan had finally achieved what centuries of war had failed to create on their own. A unified state, not unified by shared culture alone, not unified by tradition alone, but unified through structure, surveillance, and control. The Tokugawa shogunate did not end conflict by removing it. It ended conflict by containing it. And containment is not peace. It is pressure held in place. Edo became the new center of Japan. Not Kyoto, not the imperial court. Edo, a city built around administrative control and military governance. The shogun ruled from there with absolute authority over policy, law, and the structure of society. But this authority depended on one principle above all others: balance between loyalty and restriction. The daimyo still existed, still ruled their domains, still controlled local samurai, but their independence was carefully limited. They were required to spend alternating years in Edo under a system that ensured constant surveillance and financial strain. Their families remained effectively held within the capital. Their movements were regulated. Their power was monitored. And their loyalty was enforced not only through military pressure, but through structural dependency. This system created stability, but it also created stagnation. Because when movement is controlled, innovation slows. When power is centralized too tightly, ambition is redirected inward. The samurai class changed again under this system. They were no longer battlefield warriors. There were no longer large-scale wars to fight. Instead, they became bureaucrats, administrators, record keepers, enforcers of law rather than instruments of conquest. Their swords remained symbolic of status, but their daily reality was paperwork, governance, and service within a rigid hierarchy. For many samurai, identity became uncertain. They were trained for war, but lived in peace. And that contradiction shaped a quiet cultural transformation. Philosophy and discipline became central to samurai identity. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was refined and formalized, not as battlefield necessity, but as moral structure, a way to give meaning to a class that no longer fought constantly. Loyalty, discipline, honor, and restraint became defining values, not because war demanded them, but because peace required psychological structure to replace combat identity. Meanwhile, Japan was isolated from much of the outside world. Foreign contact was heavily restricted. Trade was controlled and limited. Christianity was suppressed as a potential destabilizing influence. The goal was not engagement with global systems. It was internal stability above all else. This isolation created a unique condition. A nation that was internally structured but externally closed. Stable but static. Controlled but constrained. For over 2 centuries, this system held, longer than any previous Japanese political structure. And for a time, it appeared permanent. But no system is truly permanent, especially one built on the suppression of change rather than its integration. Within the Tokugawa system, economic pressure slowly accumulated. Merchant classes grew in wealth despite low social status. Urban centers expanded. Samurai stipends became increasingly strained relative to cost of living. Social categories became rigid, but economic reality became fluid. And that contradiction created quiet tension beneath the surface of stability. Cultural life, however, flourished in new ways. Art, theater, literature, and urban culture expanded significantly. With war removed from daily life, creativity shifted into non-military expression. The samurai class, no longer defined by battlefield action, became part of a highly structured but increasingly symbolic social order. But beneath this controlled society, change from the outside world was approaching again. Foreign powers were beginning to expand across oceans. Technological development was accelerating globally. And Japan's isolation, once a source of stability, was becoming a vulnerability. Because systems that do not adapt externally eventually face pressure internally. By the early 19th century, that pressure began to approach Japan's shores. Foreign ships began appearing. Demands for trade increased. And the isolation policy that had sustained Tokugawa stability began to weaken under external force. The arrival of modern naval power revealed a critical imbalance. Japan had preserved internal order, but had not evolved alongside global technological change at the same pace. And that imbalance would soon break the system entirely. Because stability that resists adaptation eventually meets forces it cannot regulate. The long peace of the Tokugawa era had held Japan together for generations. But it had also delayed transformation. And now transformation was no longer optional. It was approaching from outside. And it would not wait for permission. Japan had spent over 2 centuries building stability through isolation. But isolation only works when the outside world remains still. And the outside world had not remained still. It had accelerated. Industrial power, naval expansion, global trade networks, military technology advancing faster than any previous era in human history. And Japan remained structurally unchanged. The Tokugawa system still held internal order. But it was an order built on control, not adaptation. And control becomes fragile when external pressure exceeds internal flexibility. The arrival of Western naval forces shattered a quiet assumption that had lasted for generations. That Japan could remain self-contained indefinitely. Foreign ships appeared with increasing frequency. Demands for trade became demands for access. And access became pressure. The arrival of Commodore Perry's fleet marked a turning point. Not because Japan was immediately conquered, but because the existence of overwhelming external force broke the illusion of separation. Japan could no longer remain closed without consequence. The shogunate was forced into negotiation. And negotiation itself revealed weakness. Because systems built on internal control struggle when faced with external equality or superiority. Treaties were signed. Ports were opened. Trade restrictions began to loosen. And each concession created internal instability. Not because trade itself was destructive, but because it disrupted the balance that Tokugawa governance depended on. The daimyo saw opportunity in change. Some supported opening. Some resisted. But all recognized that the existing system was no longer fully in control. And when authority loses control of change, it begins to lose authority itself. Economic pressure intensified rapidly. Inflation increased. Traditional stipends lost value. Merchant classes grew more powerful. Samurai financial stability declined. The class structure that had been rigid for centuries began to show cracks under economic reality. And those cracks spread through political structure as well. The shogunate attempted reform. But reform within a rigid system often arrives too late to stabilize it. Every adjustment revealed deeper instability. And every attempt at control exposed reduced capacity for enforcement. Meanwhile, imperial sentiment in Kyoto began to re-emerge politically. Not as direct power, but as ideological alternative. The emperor became a symbol again. A focal point for those who opposed shogunate weakness in dealing with foreign pressure. The idea of restoring imperial authority gained traction among reform-minded factions. Not because the emperor had regained military strength, but because legitimacy was being questioned at the level of governance itself. Japan was now divided not only by region or domain, but by vision. One side seeking to preserve shogunate order through adaptation, another seeking to restore imperial authority as the center of renewal. And beneath both, rising pressure from modernization that neither system fully controlled. The samurai class found itself at the center of this transformation. For generations, they had defined Japanese order. Now they were losing their functional role. Modern firearms and military organization reduced the value of traditional battlefield identity. Economic decline weakened their status. Political instability divided their loyalty. They were no longer the undisputed backbone of society. They were becoming uncertain participants in a system losing coherence. And uncertainty in a warrior class is never stable. Tensions escalated. Domains began preparing independently. Alliances shifted quietly. Reformist factions gained influence within key regions, and resistance to the shogunate strengthened under the banner of restoring imperial rule and national unity. What followed was not a single revolution, but a structural breakdown of the Tokugawa order, a slow transition from controlled stability into open conflict. The system that had prevented war for centuries was now unable to contain political transformation. And once transformation begins inside a rigid system, collapse is no longer a possibility. It becomes a trajectory. Japan was approaching the final phase of its feudal structure, where the samurai class would be forced to redefine itself again, where political authority would be completely reorganized, and where centuries of warrior governance would finally give way to a modern state. The long isolation had ended, and with it, the old Japan was beginning to dissolve. Japan was no longer stable in the way the Tokugawa system had once promised. It was transitioning, slowly at first, then all at once. Because once legitimacy is questioned at every level of society, control can no longer remain centralized. The pressure that had been building from foreign contact, economic imbalance, and internal political division finally reached a point where the old system could not absorb it anymore. The shogunate was no longer the unquestioned center of authority. It was one faction among many, and that realization changed everything. The divide between pro-shogunate and pro-imperial forces hardened quickly, not just as political disagreement, but as competing visions of what Japan itself should become. One side wanted to preserve the existing order through controlled reform. The other wanted to restore imperial authority and restructure the entire political system around it. But neither side could avoid the reality that both were operating inside a system already breaking apart. Domains began to act independently again, not as a return to Sengoku chaos, but as preparation for inevitable conflict. The samurai class, once the foundation of stability, now found itself split across competing loyalties. Some remained aligned with the shogunate, others aligned with imperial factions, and many were forced into decisions they could no longer avoid. Because neutrality was disappearing, the system was collapsing into confrontation. Military modernization accelerated under foreign pressure. Firearms, naval technology, and new organizational structures changed the nature of warfare again. Traditional samurai combat methods no longer defined battlefield effectiveness. Coordination, logistics, and modern weaponry became decisive. And with that shift, centuries of samurai identity began to transform at its core. The symbolic warrior class of Japan was no longer the dominant military force. It was being absorbed into a new national structure that no longer depended on inherited martial tradition. The final conflict that emerged from this instability was not simply a civil war. It was a systemic transition, a replacement of political order, a restructuring of authority itself. The Boshin War marked the decisive break. Imperial forces advanced against shogunate loyalists. Domains chose sides based on survival, ideology, and calculated positioning. Battles were fought across multiple regions, not as isolated engagements, but as a coordinated shift toward a new political center. Edo, the long-standing seat of shogunate power, ultimately surrendered. Not because resistance was impossible, but because the system supporting resistance had collapsed. With the fall of the shogunate, imperial authority was restored. But this was not a return to the past. It was the creation of something entirely new. The Meiji Restoration did not revive old imperial Japan. It transformed it. The emperor became the symbolic center of a modernizing state. Feudal domains were abolished. The daimyo class was dismantled. The samurai class was formally ended as a legal social structure. Stipends were removed or converted. Swords were eventually banned from daily life. And military service was reorganized into a modern conscript army. In a single generation, the warrior system that had defined Japan for nearly 1,000 years was dismantled. Not through gradual decline alone, but through deliberate restructuring under a modern state vision. The samurai did not disappear in a single moment, but their role as a class ended. Their identity dissolved into a new national structure that no longer required hereditary warriors. Some adapted, some resisted, many faded into civilian life. And what remained of their legacy became cultural memory rather than active political force. Japan entered a new era. Industrialization, centralized government, modern military systems, global engagement. A nation rebuilt not around warrior loyalty, but around institutional structure. But beneath this transformation, the entire history of the samurai remained embedded in the system that replaced it. Because even after disappearance as a class, their influence shaped discipline, hierarchy, loyalty culture, and national identity. The story of the samurai was no longer a story of warriors alone. It had become the story of Japan's entire political evolution. From fragmentation to warlord rule to centralized shogunate order to modern state formation. 1,000 years of transformation compressed into one continuous historical arc. And at its core, always the same force. Power shifting wherever it could be enforced. Not declared. Enforced. And Japan, through every era, had always followed that rule.